do censorship. It does it makes you do censorship, self-censorship. So you decide what area to work on. The state is very sophisticated. And for the few people who are jack in the boxes and keep popping out and mavericks, bang, it bludgeons them. So next week we are going to see Vinayak Sen, the Vice President of the Civil Liberties, the Indian People's Union of Civil Liberties, facing completely fictitious charges that he's a Maoist sympathizer. He's a doctor, did great health work in tribal areas of this country, being prosecuted with completely forged documents, false charges, etc. But it's going to be a seminal turning point in how India treats one of its most famous civil liberties. He was a medical doctor. You have another phenomenon in India, which the Russians are only learning now. The Zimbabweans will never learn on this issue, which is the suborning of NGOs. So you plant people, you infiltrate people into the NGOs. I've been a victim of it. A former staff member of mine is one-man Friday of the Intelligence Bureau. Now I have the evidence. Riaz Khan, who is trying to create problems for one of India's most famous women activists, who's taken on the Gujarat government on the anti-Muslim killings. Tista Setalwar, who Riaz Khan has now turned state flunky and is her number 2 and is trying to destroy Tista's work against the state and its repression. There's a curious organization in Gujarat called the National Council for Civil Liberties. Hallelujah, it says civil liberties. And all its cases are against Medha Patkar in the Supreme Court, trying to destroy Medha Patkar, a woman of great courage, integrity and grassroots support, who is fighting for the tribals and landless peasantry in many states in India. So you see the state now dealing with new ways of things, suborning, implanting things. So the Indian state is an extremely sophisticated state, unlike Pakistan or Bangladesh or Nepal or any of these states. It's in a category of itself when it wants to deal with dissent. So you see this problem in many states in India. What are the problems and what are the challenges? And I'll give you print out these things because I'm not great at, I'm not even good at, as I told you, I'm a Luddite, so I confess right outside, so you can get the printouts and you can. But what are the problems and challenges at the moment? The Indian civil liberties movement has a major challenge because it's on the cusp of either it goes 2 steps forward or, as Lenin said, 3 steps backward. It's on the cusp. And does it recognize that its long-term development is linked to deep-rootedness in the community and not with the umbilical cord of the donor agencies, both governmental and non-governmental. We have now a governmental agency also doing a lot of funding in India, and governmentally controlled funding agencies in India also, the National Foundation of India, KEPART, etc., etc., etc. So the Indian state is much more sophisticated apart from the international donor agencies. What has happened? And for that you need to understand the US also. You need to understand global politics on civil society. Even this debate is not very articulate in the US. The American establishment was taken aback by the societal response in the aftermath of the Tet Offensive in Vietnam in '68, where students after '68 just came out on the streets. So whether students got fired in Kent University or was on the streets on the Washington Mall or outside the UN or whatever else, the American students really came out on the streets. Read somebody like Vincent Sheen and you'll know exactly the strength of the movement. But the then Secretary of Defense, Mr. McNamara, a very intelligent, astute man, not not painted like a moron like the leftists tried to do. The left painting of it was infantile. The man was of great intelligence. His next job as Secretary after Defense, leaving the Johnson administration as Secretary of State for Defense, was, guess what? Bank. He was the World Bank top honcho. And he figured out a theory on how to deal with social movements. He said, look, we can't crush them. They don't work. You can't bludgeon them into silence. They don't work. So if you can't join them, if you can't smash them, join them and co-opt them. So what he did was, that was the beginning of the huge donor interest in social movements and issues. The World Bank theory of trickle down, that things can trickle down. You don't have to have a revolution. You don't have to have a concert in the streets. So so a whole new array of governmental and non-governmental, private and other donor agencies mushroomed in the US. So everything became so from the streets, from the parliament of the streets, everything got into conference rooms and seminars. So no longer were social movements trying to create new situations on the street, trying to change people. But you said, let's do a report, let's discuss it in a seminar, and we'll give the report to the donor agency, we'll file it away and nothing will ever happen. Here we go around the mulberry bush. This was replicated all over the world, and in India very successful. And I'm not being facetious on this. I'm not being very facetious on this. There's some excellent work done by British economists on this. And I think I've given you a few in my further reading list. If I haven't, email me and I'll give you how the whole aid donor industry was created in the early 70s. And those economists are not lefty by any stretch of imagination. They're good, nice, mainstream, but good liberals. Now, liberal is, in the US sense of the word, a bad word, but in the rest of the world, we don't follow that US, fortunately, appellation of the word liberal. So you see how social movements have completely gone. And the biggest joke is now the so-called world social movement. These annual jamborees that take place in Brazil, took place in India, and took place once elsewhere, but otherwise take place always in Brazil. Where the European social democracy and European liberalism, with the World Bank scheme of things in the 70s, has completely subsumed any protest and any dissent. And so you find this, you have everybody jumping around the maypole tree in Brazil and doing their little dance, and yet not having any real protest when there's major depression, there's major wages being cut in Europe, where there's house owners and small people in the US are facing bankruptcy like they never faced it before in the last 40 years. And there is no parliament in the streets, there's no real protest, it's all in cyberspace and everything. And so I'm very active. I'm Luddite because I don't like cyberspace. I don't like emails, protests. Join another protest or email. It's all nonsense. The state, all it has to do is press delete. And there goes your protest. And I know that for a fact because I was one of the 3 campaign coordinators in the early 80s in London in Amnesty International, who devised all the campaigns for all of Amnesty International campaigns. I had a great American colleague who died a few years ago called Mike Generisi, who was the Washington director of Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch in his last days, but was at that point in the 80s in one of my part of the 3 musketeers on the campaign team of Amnesty, who designed all the campaign strategy for each and every country in the world. We found that there was a law of diminishing returns on the amnesty letters of protest. Sophisticated states like Israel decided not to send angry letters in protest. They would send you a nice, polite letter done out of a machine, computer machine. I think the computer first started coming on those huge computers which took half a wall there, and which was basically less than a 286. And they turned out a machine signed with the Attorney General of Israel's signature, saying, "Thank you very much for your letter, your concerns are being addressed, and we shall get back to you in due course of time. Nobody ever got back to you in due course of time. Your concerns were never addressed, but you got a polite letter, and this old school lady in somewhere in Massachusetts, in some old school, who written this letter on a Saturday evening, taking 2 hours of from her housework, saying that, dear Mr. President, please don't hit people on the West Bank or something. Got this polite letter. She'd done her Girl Guide, good deed of the day. She felt happy and hunky-dory, and nothing ever happened. She was altruistic. You felt happy, everything. Now, Israel was a little more sophisticated. Indians, we were not sophisticated, but we were still smart. What we did was we got the letters in thousands at our ministries, and the Joint Secretary concerned, which is a senior official who takes the decisions, he said, quick disposal. So quick disposal in 20 years ago, 10 years ago in India meant you file them away carefully. The British told us to file everything, so you filed everything carefully. Put them in the basement of the Home Ministry and never saw the letter. Nowadays, the quick disposal means the shredder, because we've now switched from the British model to the American model. So it's now the shredder. But we don't still write you angry letters. If you wrote to stupid Russian government people, now even Putin is learning. I think Medvedev is a major improvement on telling Putin, you need to fine-tune the response. You would get an angry response from some low-level Russian official or some low-level Zimbabwean official, which didn't help anybody. So the grades were different, but the states have become much more sophisticated, extremely sophisticated in dealing with non-governmental responses. The non-governmental responses have not been equally sophisticated. They've been blundering around. It's Alice in Blunderland, the non-governmental organization. So unless we reconnect to social movements and community-based movements, I think the state across the world, all states, are accruing to themselves greater powers, and states in South Asia have accrued to themselves tremendous powers. Fortunately, in the US, with all the power of the US state, yet you have very powerful citizens' movements. You have a New York Times, which I don't have. Here, the Times of India gets a phone call from the principal information officer of the government of India, and the story is killed. This is the premier newspaper of this country. And I'm not being facetious. I can give you instances of specific stories. Yet, nobody would dare to call the editors of the New York Times and say, kill that story. Period. The New York Times is, along with the Guardian, the only major newspaper putting out all the WikiLeaks in spite of the American government's extreme discomfort with this problem. Extreme. That's the strength of the United States model. There's lots that's wrong. Give me an organization like the Civil Liberties Union, the American Civil Liberties Union. It's a brilliant, efficacious, absolutely wonderful organization. Make sure you donate to the Civil Liberties Union for Christmas and New Year. For them. They're a great outfit. They're a great outfit. If they weren't there, I think the quality of democratic polity would be a lot less in the United States than it is. We do not have that kind of model anywhere in the world. The closest that comes to it is Liberty in the UK, but it uses a very pale comparison of what the ACLU is. So you have today the space on the surface for human rights work actually decreasing. Not very manifest because, as I told you, we're on the cusp, and a lot will depend on what happens in the next 10 to 20 years. We are running the gauntlet at the moment, and we don't know whether we come out better or for worse, because if you look at all the countries around us, we're in terrible shape. Sri Lanka is in terrible shape. Lawyers who defend human rights activists or people in detention have grenades thrown in. I was last weekend at the National Judicial Academy lecturing to Sri Lankan judges, and they'd obviously done a lobotomy before they came to the National Judicial Academy. And so I had to tell them, listen, this is how you treat your lawyers. You have people throw grenades, and you guys are not recognizing this, the kind of problem that you are facing, that what legal professionals face when they come in front of you with cases of that affect what you perceive as national security. We have the problem in Kashmir. He talked about national security, and a friend of mine, maybe some of you can help me, the guy, perpetrator is now hiding in your part of the world. A friend of mine called Jalil Andrabi was secretary of the Bar Association in Kashmir, was abducted by the Indian Army, kept in illegal custody somewhere, we never know where, abducted in front of his wife, who was sitting in the front of the car with him, abducted, eyes gouged out, tortured, fingernails pulled out, bayoneted I don't know how many 100 times, and then body thrown into the Jhelum river, which flows through Srinagar. Body found after a week. The army said, we never held him, we don't have him. To cut a long story short, after 8 months of investigation, we were able to identify the army officer, somebody from Haryana, Major Avtar Singh. We filed a case in the Jammu and Kashmir High Court. The army told us on affidavit in the court that we don't have his service records because we had moved an application saying that he's an absconder. So if you declare him an absconder, please confiscate his property. They said they don't have his service records. Here in India we have a service record on even a railway gangman who hits the plates between the railways, the lowliest of the low. They didn't have the gang. Investigated, cut a long story short, they gave him the intelligence gave him a new identity, fresh passport, spirited him away to Canada, to Vancouver, because there's a large Indian diaspora in Vancouver where he could have merged. So bulldog NGOs, a few terriers went after this guy. We finally identified him and his new alias in Vancouver. He's now in California under a new identity and a new name. So we've written to friends in the American Civil Liberties Union to help us trace the guy. It's going to be difficult because California is even more difficult. It's not a small little place like Vancouver compared to the sizes. But any of you are interested in doing some Dick Tracy kind of work, email me and I could do with some help. I could do with some help. But the state puts heat on you. All this is, if you're too close to the fire, you get burnt. So if you follow up cases like this, you get burnt. I've got burnt solid back. Because this is not the only case that I've followed which is a real hot potato. Or potato, as the former American vice president said. Okay? So you get it? Who could spell the word? Huh?
Oh.
No, Shane was like
Quail.
Yeah, quail.
Quail. Never forget it. More a character now. But you see this problem. And so you see the state, the lesson in civil society must learn is that the fight for democracy and liberty and human rights is a constant battle. The minute you sit on your haunches thinking that you won the battle, you've lost it. It's a constant battle. And again, let me just quote in conclusion what Jefferson said again, my favorite. The tree of liberty has to be fertilized with the blood of martyrs in every generation. You have to constantly fight for civil liberties. There's no ideal state anywhere in the world, west or east. There's no ideal state. If somebody tells me human rights and civil liberties are protected in Europe, I'll tell you suffer from delusory amnesia. That's the medical condition. So civil liberty, it's a law of physics. If you don't fill the vacuum, somebody else will. Or as Burke said it 300 years ago, all it takes for the victory of evil is for good people to do nothing. So this is the situation, and I'm just giving you a quick overview. I hope we have some time for questions and answers and clarifications, and if you disagree with something that I've said, yell, mumble and grumble. Flows over.
I wanted to point out, you mentioned Russia and computers. And just recently, the Russian government has found a new way to try to suppress NGO.
Discussion, and he got arrested. He's now a lawyer in the Supreme Court. After spending 10 years in custody, he was sentenced to the period undergone and then released. So here was a man who just didn't agree with the official nuclear policy at that point of time, and so was called as agent of the CIA for having taken his PhD dissertation. So the Russians are just learning from our experiment. We've been masters at it for a long, long time. Subarov, fortunately, is now a lawyer in the Supreme Court, defending other people's rights, having lost his 20 years ago. It's very common in this part of the world. It's very, very common in this part of the world.
A question regarding NGOs. First of all, there's a very fascinating discussion about the evolution of NGOs and how they've served to actually co-opt social movements. Coming up with my point in time when I've become interested in understanding international progressive movements and progressive work, NGOs are sort of the place where that is done. And so I'm curious what you think. I mean, do you consider NGOs to be a viable way to go about doing human rights work still? And then also there's an additional criticism that I don't know if you really mentioned it per se, which is the fact that a lot of NGOs, one area of criticism is that they are sort of self-perpetuating, and that once established, if they do their mission, they become obsolete, because the role of an NGO is to build capacity within the society, and once that capacity is built, then, I mean, their core mission should be to make themselves unneeded, and it seems that that's not the case, because it's become such a international structure.
Well, let me start from the far end of your question. Dissent will never be dead. Dissent will always be wanted in every society. The ability to say no, this ability to say nahi in Hindi or niet in Russian will always be necessary. You have to be in any society to say no. So you will not wish yourself out of the business. But what is absolutely important to remember, that while some kind of professional NGOs in certain areas will be required, the attempt to devalue the work of social movements, of people's struggles, of trade unions, of churches, where these NGOs are mushroom for. If you are talking about civil society organization, the church was the first civil society reaction. Why doesn't anybody talk about churches in Europe and America and elsewhere where the church has a social base as the first precursors and pioneers of social movements? The church was a very important vehicle of social movements.
Martin Luther King.
Everywhere in the world. If it wasn't that Jesuit who, like Daniel amongst the lions, went into the middle of nowhere and said, I'm challenging whatever establishment, and the number of them who went to the stake and to a firing squad in many societies is too legion to enumerate here. So that's forgotten. The struggles of the trade union movement is totally forgotten. In fact, the Americans were great at forgetting labor movements. You actually created Labor Day somewhere in July, whereas May Day across the world is celebrated thanks to the American Haymarket Chicago martyrs. So you totally lobotomized the Haymarket martyrs' memory completely and said, hey, we don't want these red guys, no Sacco and Vanzetti anymore memories, thank you very much. You lobotomized it. So the whole trade movement was completely put off. Subsequent social movements of different kinds were also marginalized in a way. What you allowed in a very intelligent manner was what you felt was permissible, which was the NGO movement, which you could box in a hotel room, in a seminar room, in a conference room, and so I could fulminate, I could yell, mumble and grumble, but it didn't go beyond the precincts of this place. The minute I joined the social movement, I was in the streets. That you didn't like. So you didn't like the protests in Vancouver last summer, the summer before last, against the G8 summit and the World Economic Summit. You didn't like that. was not on. As long as you did seminars and conferences, you were fine, because you submit the reports to what? Because most of the donor agencies in the world, except a few American private donor organizations, all get, the European donor agencies, private ones, also all get government money. The Americans, of course, they have private donors, which is a different thing. There's no independent private or governmental donor in Europe. All of them get government money from the government overseas aid. Whereas in the US, there are a lot of private, genuine philanthropy in the US is a little more different than elsewhere in the world. So you have genuine private donors. But yet you don't have, you have priorities which are completely not real. Take, for example, Bill Gates, the Melinda Gates Foundation, and the rest of the private donors into health in India. There's any amount of money today for AIDS work and HIV work, which is an important issue. It's not, nobody's saying it's not important. But when you look at the health problems in India, it is a very minor problem. The major health problem in India today is tuberculosis. There is no money for tuberculosis eradication. There is the biggest health disaster and emergency in India is tuberculosis. There is no money for tuberculosis in India because the fat cats of the world have decided that it's AIDS and HIV. Not that it's not important, it's important. But put your money where the priorities in that particular society are. So, because the tuberculosis is not the fat cats of the world who get tuberculosis, it's the poor who work in unhygienic conditions, the environmental problems in the quarries and the asbestos industry, pulling a rickshaw, make sure you get tuberculosis. AIDS, you have the choice not to get infected or not, depending on the way you do permissive or sexual relations or not. Unless you get infected badly by some blood injection in a terrible hospital using a needle somewhere else. But in tuberculosis you have no choice. It's your profession which gets you the hand cart puller in India by this year. He starts hand cart pulling at 20. By the year 30 he has tuberculosis because hand cart pulling takes the stuff out of your chest. The chests are not in. So you see how. So I'm not saying that NGOs should be wished to. I would like an NGO, for example, the American Civil Liberties Union is an NGO, but it is a cutting edge, it also does a lot of interventions. The Center for Citizens Constitutional Rights in New York does excellent academic work. It doesn't go out on the street, but it intervenes in cases in the district courts, in the federal courts, in the Supreme Court. But we don't have that kind of NGOs. All we're doing is doing reports, submitting to the donor agencies, holding seminars and conferences, and forgetting it. The interventionist character of what a civil society organization, a non-state organization should be, is being lost. Whether it's in the parliament or the streets, or in courts, or in other areas where you come into contact with the state and its agencies.
I'm just really curious. I mean, you've given us a very broad and interesting history of social movements. I mean, in the U.S. we have these strong organizations, but we don't have a social movement, really. We don't have, I mean, ACLU does its work kind of in isolation. It's still effective, but there's no grassroots movement really supporting its work most of the time. And what are the conditions for getting that, for creating that?
Well, you had very powerful social movements, and even today they are manifest, but not manifest like they were in the 60s and 70s. For example, you had the Farm Workers Union, the United Farm Workers Union in Chavez, in your part of the world, on the West Coast. The fact that nobody bought peaches for years until proper prices were given to peach farmers. By the way, today the richest peach king is a man of Indian origin in the US, who bought a house opposite Blair House for the Sikhs when he supported the Khalistani movement. So the Indian government went completely ballistic. He was so rich, he just bought a house right opposite Blair House in Washington and put up the flag of Khalistan, which is just imagine the thing. And Americans couldn't do a thing about it because he was paying hard dollars and he was doing completely legally. All he was doing was buying a house. So if you can have Robert Lee's flag and the civil law war flag, why can't you have the Khalistan flag? But just an interesting aside. So you had movements. Even today, like yesterday, President Obama signed into force the repeal of the do not tell, whatever informed earlier.
Don't ask, don't tell.
The Clinton administration thing. Now the fact is that the gay rights movement and their wider constituency created a social movement to make sure that it went. It wasn't done just because a section of the Democratic Party or a few people who switched sides from the Republican Party wanted things to happen. It was because because today social mobilization is not taking place in traditional areas in the United States. It's taking place. I would have liked social mobilization to take place on people who lost their houses thanks to the banks calling in their loans. There wasn't. Instead of that, you had a regressive social movement in the form of the Tea Party brigade, that Tea Party brigade. So there is, every society goes through these ups and downs. I'm sure the US will swing back at some point in time because the broad discussion debates in the US are much more deeper than they are here. Because you cannot get a Washington Post and a New York Times to fudge things. You can definitely get the Miami Herald to do it, but you can't get the Philadelphia Inquirer or the Washington Post or the thing. Whereas here you can get every single newspaper with the exception of a few small fringe newspapers to fudge the debate on a range of issues. That's the difference. Sorry.
I just want to follow up. In the city I grew up in Detroit, Michigan, the black Afro-American churches have always been the center of social movement, and they still are. So we back to the churches is what.
Churches were key to social mobilization in the U.S. from a long time, and it's not just recent. It's a very old tradition, and so the church was a very important mobilizing point. Even here, the National Fishermen's Union in India, because a lot of the fishing communities across India are Christians. They've benefited a lot from the support of the church lay priests, though the official church has been very pro-establishment. But the parish priest looking after his parish has always been sympathetic to the problems of the Dalits and the Dalit Christians. The church has played a very pioneering role in mobilization in that area, because we in the upper caste just have forgotten that this huge mass of humanity in India has been obliterated in more ways than one. So we've seen how the church has played a role and faith movements in other places. There are smaller examples of such faith movements in other places also, but very small compared to what the church has done in terms of social mobilization. Sorry.
No offense, as we are sitting.
Please tell your name, please. Those who want to put the quiz, please tell your name also. Please.
Sir, myself Sumedha, I'm from Nalsar University. Sir, no offense, but as we are sitting at Indira Gandhi National University, I just want to clear my misconception if it is.
Be as offensive, don't worry. Don't pull any punches.
So that time during emergency, what Indira Gandhi played, like she suspended even the right to life, right to liberty, and then even if her Blue Star operation is justified on some grounds, but the role she played in emergency her role is justified in any way as far as the human rights.
Neither was Blue Star justified. Neither was Blue Star justified in any way. No, there is nothing of hers justified on civil liberties. I won't paint her completely black because there were certain other areas that she did good. But on civil liberties, she was not the paragon of virtue by any stretch of imagination. You would have to be what Shelley calls in English literature, do what is called a willing suspension of disbelief if you felt she was in any way committed to civil liberties and democratic freedoms. She was terrible during the emergency. In 1984, she arrested boys who were 12 and 14 and 16 from the Sikh religious schools. A great Indian freedom fighter called Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay, a great Indian freedom fighter, went to the Supreme Court in her 80s and argued the petition herself in person and had those boys released. Said, how dare you arrest 14 and 16 and 18? So we've had women of great and men of great courage in this country, so that's why it's democratic. See, it's not thanks to Indira Gandhi. I mean, her father was different. Her father was genuinely a statesman. She did other things in geopolitics, which clearly she has full marks for. But on civil liberties and democracy, give me another one.
Sir, could you,
Sorry.
just for the US students, explain what Blue Star and...
Sorry. The Blue Star was an operation in the mid-80s in the Punjab against what is called the Golden Temple. It's like the holiest of holiest shrine for the Sikh community in India. And it's like the Vatican is for the Catholics, the Golden Temple is for the Sikhs. It's like what is Mecca to the Muslims, it is to the Sikhs. And in a completely unnecessary move, while there were armed militants in the area, you could have easily starved them out, you could have cut the water and electricity, and over a week or 10 days you could have starved them out. There was no necessity to send in tanks, there was no use. They were definitely armed, they were well trained, they were led by a former general of the Indian Army called General Shabeg Singh, who was a hero of the 1971 war in Bangladesh. It was he who created the irregular Bangladesh Mukti Bahini. So he knew everything about guerrilla warfare. So he was in charge of the Sikh militants in the Golden Temple. But it was not completely unnecessary. You demolished the Golden Temple for all practical purposes. I was there 3 days after it was attacked and flattened. Including the Harmandir Sahib, the Sanctum Sanctorum of the temple was demolished with straight shots from tanks, that T-20 Russian tanks that were used on the narrow lanes. So completely. A section of the army advised against it, but she was not willing to listen. A former head of the Punjab Police Intelligence, a man named Mr. Mathur, said that don't do this in the Punjab. He was not a Sikh. He advised Mrs. Gandhi, please don't do it. And for audacity and for his temerity to contradict Mrs. Gandhi, he was made Director General Fire Services from head of police intelligence. So she wasn't willing to take good advice, period. So you had the attack, and then of course the Sikh militancy got a new lease of life, and it was crushed ruthlessly. Over 30,000 people lost their lives. And unlike most people in India who believe that it's gone forever, I don't believe. So because many of the root causes have not yet been addressed. You have to address Sikh identity. You have to give greater autonomy to Indian states. So the Indian state has less powers than a mayor in somewhere in the middle of nowhere in Kansas. So you can't have, we are not really a federal state. We call ourselves a federal state, we are very unitary in structure. The federal government has huge powers accruing to itself. And so there is the problem of decentralization and autonomy will have to be addressed at some stage once again.
Okay, seriously, but
Please. Your name, please.
my name is Sohaib Jalalla. I'm from Sudan, but I'm studying persuasive LLM business law at Symbiosis Law School, Symbiosis International University. I would like to ask you, sir, that according to the period of time of 1970s, there are many kinds of the political and social crisis was happening in India, and because it was affecting the surrounding of the world, that the invasion is from the Union Soviets to Afghanistan and so on, and some kinds of the social crisis inside India itself. Indira Gandhi actually, she ruled by the ironing of Anne at that period of time. But do you think that she succeeded to keep the unity of the nations and the country itself at that time, or not?
See, you had Indira Gandhi clone in your country.
Because actually our politicians,
I know.
They called
I know. I happen to know. I happen to know Sudan very well. I happen to know Sudan very well. Been to Khartoum a couple of times in the old days. So I know. And I've been to Juba and what is it. So no, we had an Indira Gandhi clone in Khartoum, a man called General Nemeri.
Yeah, anyway,
Okay.
yes.
So
There's street of Mahatma Gandhi also.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And so we had Mr. Nimeri and Sudan. All these guys thought that you could accrue power. India is, as a political construct, is very new. It's only 60 years old since independence. And as a civilization, we can be 5,000 years old, but as a political construct, we're only 60 years old. And any political construct which is so nascent in its political formation takes time to create institutions. And institutions are created by inclusiveness, by tolerance, by acceptance of diversity, and by making sure that everybody shares part of the cake. The minute you try to create what the Germans did in Nazi Germany, ein Volk, ein Fatherland, and one language, and one people, and one nation, then you are up, down there, downhill. Look at Sri Lanka. In 1965, after the death of Nehru, we had a Prime Minister who was a very small man in terms of height, and embarked on a disastrous policy in India which would have broken India in 1965-66. A man called Mr. Shastri. But the man was a big man. A big man because he had the sense to understand that he made a mistake, and he quickly backtracked. He tried to impose a two-language policy in India, which was Hindi as the most dominant language and English for official correspondence. He wanted to completely negate the role of states, and over a period of time negate the role of English also. There was hell to play in southern India, mostly in Tamil Nadu. There was a strong anti-Hindi movement. It would have broken India. Until 1963, the ruling party in Tamil Nadu, the present ruling party, had as part of its manifesto secession as one of its goals, secession from India. But in 65, he realized that he had made a mistake, and he had the good sense to withdraw that policy. Immediately after independence, Nehru and others did not want to give states based on linguistic differences. Wanted to create bigger states on different lines. There was a huge agitation. One very famous Andhra freedom fighter died on this, Putti Sriramalu. And states were carved out on linguistic grounds. It is these concessions to sub-nationalist feeling, to diversity which is really in India, to language ethnic identities which has kept India today. If you had tried to rule India with the iron fist, like Mrs. Gandhi thought she could, India would have been the republic of many republics in India. So it is, even the Sikh problem in the Punjab arose out of a resolution called the Anandpur Sahib resolution, which if you read carefully, all the propaganda against it was a secessionist document. It wasn't a secessionist document. It was a document asking for greater autonomy. But the dominant media just propagated that it was secessionist. If you read it, it's on the web, read it. There's nothing secessionist about it. It's only asking for greater decentralization and autonomy. And it created one of the most powerful secessionist movements in India, which had to be crushed with fire and sword. You cannot rule a country with 480 major languages, 1060 minor languages, ethnic groups belonging to every hue and shade of the human race. We have people from the purest Aryan blood, we have people from African stock, we have people from the Semitic stock, we have people from Dravidian stock, we have people from Proto-Australoid stock, name it, which country no other country has it, indigenous to itself. You cannot create an artificial construct. It has to be a voluntary union of feeling. This is where the anti-colonial struggle under Gandhi created this voluntary union of people. It cannot be imposed by a state through an ordinance. This is where people forget. This is what Nimeri forgot in the sea. half the problems in the south would not have taken place if the roots lie during that period.
Now 9th of January
Yeah.
to be separated.
Yeah, so that, let's see, the vote, I am not as optimistic as Mr. Garang and his company would not have got the space in the sun if Mr. Nimeri had not started those policies then in the 70s. So everywhere in the world, look at Sri Lanka. It was purely a language problem in the 50s. You did not recognize language rights, it became ethnic rights, it became secession. So you have to understand that cannot be unity at the barrel of a gun. Unity means a voluntary fusion and abnegation of certain of our individualities to a wider whole because of common economic, social and political interests. Look at the Soviet Union. It went up in smoke the minute the power of the state was withdrawn for a brief period of time. Though the Soviet Constitution before the fall of the Soviet Union clearly said that you had the right to secede, each state, but in reality none existed. You'd get a kick in your pants and go off to a gulag double quick if you try to do anything else. So it has to be a voluntary union of states. This is where the constructs are taking place in different countries which have what's this? And it's not just to the developing world. Look at the way Belgium is going to go. For 1 year, everybody is yelling that Iraq does not have a government for 1 year, etc., etc. The American CNN and BBC keeps telling the Iraqis, you jokers, why don't you look at Belgium? They haven't had a government for a year. The Flemish and the French are fighting like worse than cats and dogs. And by the end of next month, maybe there will be 2 separate countries. But why isn't there any focus on Belgium? So it's also how the media constructs some of these disputes and how it focuses. Well, that's a geopolitical question, but you need to be conscious of.
Sir,
Yeah.
I am Anand Padmanabh. I am from the same district where Mr. Gopal Gowda was. So there was a great wave of social movement at that time. Former Chief Minister of Karnataka, Jayant Patel, Bangarappa, all have come from. But why socialist movement has died there? My father is also using to tell that Gopal Gowda was a great leader.
I'll take the question in the context of the social movements rather than the socialist left movement. You see, the question is part of when the state reacts, unless you as social movements also improvise and constantly evolve, you get smashed. What happened in Karnataka, which is he's referring to a major peasant movement in the 50s. What happened in the 70s was the then Chief Minister of Devarajas did land reforms of a kind that even West Bengal had not done, which is he's not given credit for that. He did land reforms. So much of the landless peasantry base of these social movements, once they got land, moved on to other. So you didn't go to the next year of then trying to organize small peasants and small kisans into bigger formations, into cooperatives, like was done in Maharashtra. So these social movements slowly disintegrated because you didn't create bases. This is exactly what had happened in Kerala. Today, the great left movement in Kerala is going up in smoke, or in West Bengal is going up in smoke, because Operation Barga, the land reforms, only stayed up to the caste society in India. It did not touch the tribal areas. It did not touch many of the Dalit areas. So the great Marxists understood classless society, but they didn't understand casteless society. And in India, you can't address social inequality without also addressing the caste equalities, inequalities. So this is where I think now finally the Marxists are doing Rip Van Winkle, or in the Indian thing, Kumbhakarna. We have a man who slept also for 20 years like Rip Van Winkle. So the Marxists are all rubbing their eyelids and saying, oh, what's happened? And so now they're looking at caste with new light. But it's because you don't understand that you have to constantly improvise and go to the next year. You suddenly get history moves on and leaves you behind. So good people, but they all got left high and dry. Sorry.